Hi, David Mold here. The other day I was at CNN.com and came across this story about a man named Peter Thiel who was about to give a lecture in Rome about the Antichrist. Who was this man? I'd never heard the name before, and why Rome? I did a quick Google on him, and this is what I found. This is Google now. I'm put it up on your screen. Peter Thiel is a German American billionaire entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and political activist known as a co-founder of PayPal and what is this? Palantir Technologies, as well as the first outside investor in Facebook. Described as an intellectual architect of Silicon Valley's contemporary ethos, he's a prominent right-wing libertarian conservative who has become increasingly focused on apocalyptic, theological, and geopolitical threats. Who is Peter Thiel? Kingmaker. A key political donor, he is credited with catapulting J.D. Vance into the U.S. vice presidency and bankrolling Republican campaigns. What drives his interest in the Antichrist? Thiel's interest in the Antichrist is not purely religious, but a hybrid of theology, technology, and political theory. He defines the Antichrist as an evil king or tyrant or anti-Messiah who appears in the end times to create a totalitarian, one world government. That's Dr. Google for you. Now, at the time I read this, I was at one of the low points in my 55-year ministry, and said so in our very next newsletter, which we entitled Peter Thiel, Iran, and the Antichrist. That's how much I was struck by the CNN article. So why was I low? One of the reasons was this. As much as we'd written about the Antichrist in our newsletters over the past few years, I felt it just wasn't resonating. Nobody seemed really interested in connecting the Bible with specific dots in history, which is the only way the true Antichrist will ever be found. Basically, I'd begun to say to myself, why bother? And then came this story about Thiel. Was it coincidence that I should have read this story at the very time when I'd almost felt like giving up? Or was God trying to get my attention, to encourage me, to assure me that I'm not the only one stirred by the subject of Antichrist? Friend, I've chosen to believe that in this article God was speaking to me. And this video you're about to watch is the result. I believe God is behind it. I believe He's pulled me out of my pity party to produce a telecast that might be a blessing to many. So here goes. Welcome to our telecast, Peter Thiel, Iran, and the Antichrist. Remember those dots in history that I mentioned? Let's get to them. Let's start in the 16th century when the Protestant Reformation was unfolding. Back then, all its major proponents taught that the papacy or Vatican or Roman Catholic Church system was the very Antichrist predicted in the scriptures. Why did they teach this? No doubt it was based on at least three factors. One, the church's doctrines. Two, its history of slaughter. And three, its arrogant lording itself over mankind. To them, these would all have appeared to match what the scriptures predicted about the Antichrist. There are many, too many to name this morning, but here are some who held to that position. I want to show you some of the people who absolutely stood on the principle that the Vatican or papacy or Roman Catholic Church system was the Antichrist. Remember, there was no America back then, and we're starting in the 16th century. American Protestantism would come later. So let's start with the Germans. In particular, let's start with the father of the Protestant Reformation, the German monk Martin Luther. Martin Luther declared that the Pope is the very Antichrist. Next, Philip Melanchthon, Luther's colleague. As a measure of how fast and how deep the Reformation spread across Europe, in 1530, Barely 13 years after Luther nailed his thesis to the castle church door at Wittenberg, the Diet of Augsburg was convened to resolve the religious and political divisions caused by the Reformation. Presided over by Emperor Charles V himself, it was characterized by a massive gathering of princes, electors, and ecclesiastical authorities from across the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, I found out that it would be the largest imperial assembly between 1495 and 1648. The size of this thing is indicated by the presence of 2,000 imperial guards leading the procession. That's 2,000 policemen leading the procession. In this book in my hands, that's this book. In this book in my hands, The Great Controversy, this sentence that I'm going to read to you aptly sums up what went on in this city of 30,000 to 40,000 as dignitaries from church and state paraded in, took their seats, and prepared to hear arguments for and against the Reformation. Here's the quote from The Great Controversy. Well has that day been pronounced the greatest day of the Reformation, and one of the most glorious in the history of Christianity and of mankind. That's from page 207 of this book. The greatest day in the history of Christianity and of mankind. From a thesis that was pinned to a door in Wittenberg in 1517 by one lowly man, a man who had risen from the rank of monk to become a professor of biblical studies at the University of Wittenberg, to the convening of the Lords of the Empire in 1530. Friend, that was some revolution. That's like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. But the assembly didn't end well for the reformers. Though the doctrines of the Reformation and the abuses of the Vatican were submitted by Luther's colleague Philip Melanchthon, the Diet rejected the reformers. It is in Melanchthon's written response or apology, which is not an apology as we might understand the word today, but a defense of the document. It is in his written apology that Melanchthon and the reformers affirmed the Pope is the true Antichrist. So, all right, let's move on. Andreas Karlstadt, another colleague of Luther, supported this identification of the papacy as Antichrist. Then there was one person named Matthias Flacius. He wrote a 12-volume history called the Magdeburg Centuries, specifically to identify the Pope as the Antichrist. He based his conclusions primarily upon the Church's opposition to biblical authority, its corruption of doctrine, and its historical departures from the early Church. He argued that the Pope, as a false representative of Christ, usurped divine authority and persecuted true believers, substituting human traditions for gospel teaching. Well, let's leave Germany alone for now. Let's go over to England. Let's look at the man appointed by King Henry VIII in 1533 to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. In fact, let's look at Cranmer in conjunction with his colleagues Bishop Hugh Latimer of Worcester and Bishop Nicholas Ridley of London. What did they believe about the Antichrist? First, Cranmer. Cranmer declared that the Roman See, or seat of government, is the seat of Antichrist, and the Pope is the Antichrist himself. Nicholas Ridley, like Cranmer, Ridley argued that the Roman Church was the Antichrist seat, and as for Hugh Latimer, he taught the same thing. Having been executed by burning under Queen Mary I for their Protestant beliefs, these three became known as the Oxford Martyrs and are undoubtedly the three most prominent of almost 300 burned by the Catholic Queen. One more from Britain. Next one, William Tyndale, Bible translator, held that the papacy was a spiritual force of Antichrist, disguising itself within the church. After being betrayed and imprisoned for over 500 days for translating the Bible into English, I want you to notice that. imprisoned for translating the Bible into English. Tyndale was executed for heresy on October 6, 1536, near Brussels, by being strangled to death and then burned at the stake. I can't emphasize this enough. Tyndale not only taught that the papacy was the Antichrist, but that, true to the scripture, it had disguised itself, that's the Vatican, to look as though it was part of the Church of Christ, when it was no part of it at all. Let's move on. Over in Switzerland, there was Huldrych Zwingli. He also saw the papacy as the Antichrist. In France, there was John Calvin, who fled France for Switzerland and argued in his institutes that the Roman pontiff is the Antichrist. Theodore Beza, maybe Beza, John Calvin's successor in Geneva, likewise fled France and thought that the Roman pontiff, the Pope, is without a doubt the Antichrist. He too saw the papacy not just as an opposing power, but as a disguised enemy working from within the church. Pierre Viret, may have been Viret, a Swiss-French reformer, who along with Calvin and Farel championed the Reformation in Geneva and Vaud. Viret held that the Roman Catholic Church leadership, specifically the papacy and its clergy, constituted the Antichrist and the whore of Babylon. Wow, you're beginning to get the picture? This wasn't some flaky doctrine. In Spain, there were Casiodoro de Reina, a Spanish monk who fled the monastery to become a Protestant. He translated the entire Bible into Spanish, the Biblia del Oso, in 1569, and described the Pope as the Antichrist. Cipriano de Valera was a Spanish Protestant reformer and ex-monk. He continued the work of Reina. He revised the Spanish Bible translation and authored several works attacking the Roman Church, explicitly identifying the Pope as the Antichrist based on biblical prophecy. Next, Juan Perez de Pineda, a close associate of the Reina and active leader among Spanish Protestant exiles. He published numerous reform tracts and a Spanish New Testament in 1556 in Geneva, which promoted the view that the Roman Church had deviated into the whore of Babylon and that the Pope was the man of sin. Moving on over to Italy. In Italy, there were Pier Paolo Vergerio, a former papal diplomat who converted to Protestantism and became a tireless propagandist against Rome, writing extensively that the Pope was the Antichrist. Next, Celio Secondo Curione, a prominent Italian humanist and reformer who fled to Switzerland. Seems like Switzerland was the place to flee to when you're being persecuted in your homeland. They fled to Switzerland. He taught that the papacy was a manifestation of the anti-Christian power opposing the true church. Next was Giovanni Diodati. While active slightly later, and by that I mean he wasn't strictly 16th century, his work was done in the 17th. His theological roots were firmly in the late 16th century Italian refugee reform movement in Switzerland. He translated the Bible into Italian and held that the papacy was the Antichrist described in Revelation. When we shift to Portugal, though, that's where trouble starts. Dr. Google tells us a completely different story. And yes, much of my research was done by Google and Britannica Encyclopedia, which we'll get to. But there in Portugal, the Portuguese Reformation was severely suppressed by what's known as the Inquisition. So you're not going to have many records of what went on in the Portuguese Reformation. However, the following names have not been obliterated by the history books. Joao, from what I remember of Spanish, the J is like an H. João Ferreira de Almeida. While technically born in the early 17th century, he was a key figure who translated the Bible into Portuguese. influenced by the 16th century Reformed theology, and held that the papacy was the Antichrist. Next, what is it? Damião de Godoy, a Portuguese humanist who, while not a typical reformer, was accused by the Inquisition of holding heretical views and had ties to leaders of the Reformation like Luther and Melanchthon. Next one in Portugal, Rebelo de Sousa, identified in Inquisition records as a Lutheran or heretic in Portugal who disagreed with the Pope. Leaving Portugal, and it's interesting, some of the records we can only get from the records of the Inquisition that weren't burned. But anyway, John Knox, in April of 1547, Knox was the founder of Scottish Presbyterianism. He preached his first public sermon from the book we're going to get to today, Daniel 7. He preached at the parish kirk, that's a word for church, the parish kirk of St. Andrews. In his first sermon, he proclaimed the Pope to be the son of perdition and the Antichrist. Finally, in Sweden, we'll close with the reformer Olaf Petri, whose teaching was heavily influenced by Martin Luther. Petri confidently informed King Gustavus I that the Pope was the Antichrist. So this, my friends, was what it could be said Luther spawned all across Europe. But there were others before Luther. Noted in their opposition to the popes were John Wycliffe, a leading theologian and philosopher at the oldest university in the world, Oxford University. Wycliffe rejected the Pope as the head of the church, and as early as 1384 wrote a treatise entitled Of Antichrist and His Host. In this tract he condemned the papal system as the proud, worldly priest of Rome and the most cursed of clippers and cut purses. This view heavily influenced the Lollards in England and the 14th century Czech reformer Jan Hus. Finally, even before Wycliffe, there were the Waldenses who lived in the Alps and against whom the popes railed for centuries. One pope in particular, Innocent VIII in 1487, going so far as to issue what's been called the Bull of Extermination. We could call it the Bull of Genocide, calling for their utter destruction. It's in writing to this day, kept at the library of Cambridge University. In that bull, he was calling for the utter destruction of what some historical records claim were over 500 bishops and their congregants. It isn't surprising, therefore, based on the demonic slaughters these people received at the hand of the Vatican, even though these slaughters were later apologized for by Pope Francis on June 22, 2015, in this Waldensian temple in Turin, it's not surprising that the Waldenses too believed the papacy was the Antichrist foretold in prophecy. We're here in Turin in front of the Waldensian temple, where the Pope came and apologized to the Waldenses in 2015 for the atrocities committed during the Dark Ages against these people. Here are his exact words. On behalf of the Catholic Church, I ask you for forgiveness for the unchristian and even inhuman attitudes and actions which we have done to you throughout history. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, forgive us. That's what he said. When I think of his apology, most people today have no idea what went on against the Waldenses. I've already shown you some of the pictures, some of the etchings that are kept at Cambridge University in the library. And the reason we have them is that the head of Britain at the time, Oliver Cromwell, he was so enraged when he heard about one particular slaughter. Remember, there was a bull issued against them in 1487, a bull calling for their extermination, genocide. That's a bull coming from the church calling for the genocide of the Waldenses. 200 years later, 1655, there was one notorious slaughter in which about 1,700 of them were killed. Cromwell became so enraged when he heard about it that he sent an ambassador Samuel Morland to the Duke of Savoy and the King of France, threatening war, actually threatening war if they didn't cease the persecutions against the Waldenses. I don't know what else to say. Most people don't half realize the atrocities that have been committed. We think of atrocities and think of the Holocaust, for example. This took place 400 years before the Holocaust. You know, the pictures that I've shown you. It reinforces the point that the Vatican has been accustomed for years to sending people off into war. They call them holy wars or crusades, but it's a church in control of the state, sending the state's armies to do its dirty work. The Pope apologized. What do we think of his apology? One scene comes to mind, and I'll shut up. In that slaughter of 1655, we're told there was a time when the Vatican troops promised not to do the Waldenses any harm. They took the Waldenses naively, took them in, fed them, and then hours later the slaughter began after feeding them and treating them like Christian brothers. That's what comes to mind when I think of the Pope's apology. I'm sorry, I don't trust that apology. I just don't trust it. That's just me. I believe that the Vatican would do precisely what it did 400 years ago if it could do it and get away with it. Here's what one person said about papal apologies. This is taken from The Great Controversy, page 571. The Roman Church now presents a fair front to the world, covering with apologies her record of horrible cruelties. She has clothed herself in Christ-like garments, but she is unchanged. Great Controversy, 571. And I've traveled here to Turin to stand in front of this, what they refer to as a Waldensian temple, to hammer home the point. The slaughters happened. The Pope apologized. But do we believe him? Well, with all Protestantism's guns ablaze, in unison, preaching the same thing, saying the same thing, from Germany to Britain to France, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Sweden, and the Czech Republic, and pretty much everywhere in between, how did the Vatican turn the tide? Why don't we hear that doctrine today that the Pope is the Antichrist? How did they turn the tide? What they did was something brilliant. They convened the Council of Trent, which was held in 3 main sessions between the 13th of December 1545 and the 4th of December 1563 in Trento, Italy. Here are some paintings of the council in session. I'll just keep them on your screen so you can look at them for a while. I'm here inside the church of Santa Maria Maggiore, and I'll soon take you to the Trento Cathedral, where meetings were likewise held. Hi, we've come to Trento, Italy, where the Council of Trent was held for 18 long years, from 1545, I believe, to 63. And it was held for one main purpose, to counter the inroads that had been made by the Protestant Church, by Luther and the Reformers. How was the Church to undo what had been done when Luther nailed that thesis to the church door? It's been called the Super Bowl of church councils for 4 key reasons. Number 1, it lasted the longest. Number 2, it spanned at least 3 popes, and a 4th, Marcellus II, only lasted 2 weeks. Third, it concentrated on more Catholic doctrine than any other council. And number 4th, it lasted basically 400 years. It guided the church, you know. That's why we've come. I didn't just want to talk about the Council of Trent. I wanted to show you where that council was held. That's the Trent Cathedral behind me. I wanted to show you. I wanted you to see the place. Go Google it, look it up, get further information. That's why we're here. So the 2 key doctrines that were interesting to my mind was the doctrine of the Mass. They reaffirmed it. They didn't yield at all to Luther and the Reformers, who felt it was blasphemy to believe that the Pope could utter a few words over a piece of bread. Not the Pope, the priest and have the bread changed into the actual body of Christ. People got executed for that. Among them, Cranmer, Latimer, Ridley, countless others refused to believe that. Secondly, it was at this council that they came out with an official list of banned books. On that list, believe it or not, was the Bible in the vernacular tongue. It was prohibited. The faithful weren't allowed to read in their own language what the Bible was saying. Luther, when he first came across a Bible, was in a convent and it was in Latin. The church has done everything it can to keep the word of God away from the masses. But that's why we're here. I want you to see it, feel it, sense it, along with what else we've said. The Council of Trent, the Super Bowl of all Catholic Church councils. It is here, according to Dr. Google, that the Jesuits were assigned to serve as theologians, with Diego Lainez and Alfonso Salmeron tasked by Pope Paul III to analyze Protestant literature and prepare theological arguments for the council. Britannica Encyclopedia put it this way: noted for their educational, missionary, and charitable works, the Jesuits are regarded by many as having been the principal agents of the Counter-Reformation of the 16th and 17th century. So what is the Counter-Reformation? Notice I said what is, not what was the Counter-Reformation, but what is the Counter-Reformation, because it is still going on today. We'll get into this a little bit later. So what is it? As its name implies, it's the countering or opposing of the Reformation, the undoing of all things Protestant. That's what the Counter-Reformation is. Of course, you won't read that typically in the Catholic Encyclopedia. So let's again turn to Britannica. The Counter-Reformation, according to them, referred to efforts in the 16th and early 17th centuries to oppose the Protestant Reformation and reform the Catholic Church. Part of the Protestant literature that the Jesuits would have been called upon to counter was the literature on the Antichrist. Not surprisingly, that's the stuff that I read to you before, the list of 20-odd people and what they taught and what they wrote. That's what the Jesuits would have been called upon to counter. Not surprisingly, two of their scholars, Francisco Ribera and Luis del Alcazar, published Counter-Reformation responses that did just that. Ribera published his futurist work, which was a 500-page commentary on the Apocalypse, in 1590, while Alcazar's preterist work was published in 1614. Both deflected attention from the papacy. Here they are in our newsletter of November 23rd, 2025. So what is preterism and what is futurism? Preterism is the view that biblical end-time prophecies were fulfilled in the past, primarily during the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. This perspective interprets prophecies about the beast, Antichrist, and tribulation as historical events from the 1st century. That's preterism. Ribera's futurism, on the other hand, was a far more successful doctrine. He proposed that the first few chapters of Revelation applied to ancient Rome, but the rest, starting around chapter 4, concerned a literal future Antichrist who would reign for 3.5 years at the end of time. Does that sound familiar? Here's how we summarize the spread of this doctrine in this newsletter, our newsletter of March 22nd, 2026. Postulated first by Jesuit scholar Francisco Ribera in the late 1500s, it penetrated, that's futurism, penetrated British Protestantism in the 19th century with the aid of men like John Nelson Darby and Samuel Maitland. Before crossing the pond, that's coming to America, through Bible conferences and study Bibles, most notably the 1909 Schofield Reference Bible, which included footnotes placing Antichrist's reign in a future 7-year tribulation period. As a tribute to its success, a 2016 survey of American Protestant pastors by Lifeway Research found that 75% of Baptists and 83% of Pentecostals believe in a future literal Antichrist. That's how successful Ribera's work has been. Born with the Jesuits and the Council of Trent, futurism is the leading doctrine about the Antichrist today. It is held incredibly not by Catholics alone, but by Protestants as well. And if what Dr. Google says about Peter Thiel is true, he appears to believe it too. Gone is any reference to the Vatican and its diabolical slaughter. Gone is any reference to Vatican blasphemy, like putting Mary where Christ alone should be. Gone is any reference to 1260 years of Vatican dominance. Today it's all about a future Antichrist. But what does the Bible say? We'll break this study into 8 parts. Number 1, the word Antichrist. Number 2, Satan. Number 3, Paul. Number 4, Daniel chapter 2. Number 5, Daniel chapter 7. Number 6, uprooting 3 kings. Number 7, speaking great blasphemies. Number 8, Tertullian. And we'll close off with an epilogue.